Today is Wednesday, the 14th of September, and I am at the Athens Regional Library's boardroom speaking with Mr. Harold Crow. Harold M. Crow. What does the M stand for?
Murphy.
Sir? Thank you very much. Mr. Crow, could you tell me a little something of what you experienced during the era of World War II?
You mean about my experiences?
Your experience, yeah.
Well, I was at the University of Georgia as a sophomore, and the ROTC department asked us all to sign on in the enlisted, I believe they call it the Enlisted Reserve Corps. And the idea was that if we signed on in the Enlisted Reserve Corps, that we could probably finish school before having to go into the Army. And so I believe the entire sophomore class signed up, and about 2 months later, they needed us. And so we didn't get to finish school. And I went, when I went into the Army, I went to Camp Croft, South Carolina. And
was that near a certain town?
Spartanburg. I don't believe it's there now, but it did exist for a long time thereafter. We our class that is a basic training class started in early '43 at Camp Croft, and I hurt an ankle and missed graduating with my class. And when my ankle recovered, I was asked if I wanted to be on the cadre, that is the instruction staff there at the school or basic training camp, and I told them I would like to, and so I stayed there until about late summer of 1944. Then went to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Was shipped out of there to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and from Fort Leonard Wood to Fort Meade, Maryland, and then from there shipped out of Boston to we landed in Southampton, England, in early December. I don't remember the date, but say like the 5th or 6th of December 1944. From there we went across England and boarded some English ships to Le Havre, France, and the harbor was so cluttered with sunken ships that we had to offboard way out in the, not in the ocean, but a good way out from the harbor. And I remember that was a sort of a tough experience, going over the boat on those big rope ladders with all your equipment. New to me anyhow. I know the boys at D-Day had a lot rougher than that. They had people shooting at them. At least we didn't have anybody shooting at us. And we went from there to a replacement depot in Belgium. And then about the 20th of December, joined the 7th Armored Division, which had been in the Battle of the Bulge and had been pretty well decimated, and so they needed a lot of replacements. And by the time I got there, most of the shooting was over, fortunately for me and everybody else. But I suppose then I think at that time we were with the British. We were attached to the British 8th Army, and probably stayed with the British 8th Army. I'm almost sure we stayed with the British 8th Army until the war was over. And we went on a course northeast and ended up on the I want to say on the Baltic. That's where it was. And from there, back down just west of Berlin, and from there on, it was it was strictly a mopping up operation, almost entirely from the time I joined the 7th Armored. The Germans were pretty well whipped by the time I got there. And then I believe the armistice was in April. No,
May,
that's yeah. That's
I'm not sure either.
maybe it was May, but April or May. And then shortly thereafter, all those of us who didn't have enough points, I mean by time overseas or time in the Army to be able to come home, we were sent to Antwerp, Belgium, to go to the Pacific. That would have been in, I guess, July of '45. And about that time, President Truman dropped the bomb, and that war was over. And I was then sent from there, from Antwerp, Belgium, to Vienna, Austria, and stayed there about 6 months, and came home in 1946, in March of '46. Went back to school at the university, and I've been in Athens ever since.
Golly willies. Where were you originally from? Athens or
I
somewhere
was
else?
originally from a little town called Alto, Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
I think now there's a correctional school there.
Mm-hmm.
At the time when I lived there, it was the State Tuberculosis Hospital, and it was subsequently moved to Rome and was called then Batty Hospital.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
I had one
Can you tell
brother.
me that? Uh-huh.
He was in the Army also. He was with Patton in the 2nd Armored Division. No sisters, just the one brother.
And your parents, did they farm or
No,
do
my
something
dad
else?
was a doctor. My dad was a country doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And he was in World War I and contracted tuberculosis.
Mm.
And he lost his health, so that's the reason we ended up at Alto, because he went to work for the state in the tuberculosis hospital on staff. He could handle that, but he couldn't handle that country doctor business, because it was 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and that's the reason he joined the state staff at the hospital there. And prior to that, I was born at Talmo, Georgia, a little town between here and Gainesville. And Daddy was in practice there until about 1930.
Can you recall for me the news of December 7th of 1941 and how you came to hear that news?
Right. I was sitting with my roommate in our room on Hill Street. We were studying and heard it on the radio. About, I don't remember what time of day, it was late in the afternoon when we heard it.
Was that a boarding house or an apartment?
No, it was I believe the man was, I believe he was a dentist. And he took, I believe there were 4 of us there, 2 in our room, and I think there were 2 more across the hall, upstairs, and we just lived there with the family. We didn't eat there. We ate elsewhere.
And you had a radio in your own room, or was that the house?
Yes, sure did. In fact, I still have that radio.
Oh my God.
Yeah. I don't think it works, but I still have it.
That's quite an antique.
Yeah.
So where was the draft board in those days in Athens?
The draft board was, I'm pretty sure, at the courthouse. I didn't have any experience with the draft board. Mm-hmm. I was 18 when I came here to school, and I suppose that I registered in the draft. I don't remember. Maybe not, since I've signed up with ROTC.
Mm-hmm.
But then when we joined the Enlisted Reserve Corps, of course that put us in a totally different status. We were actually part of the Army at that time, but was in the reserve. And so I'm not sure about the location of the draft board.
When they pulled you out of the university as an enlisted ROTC, what about time of year was that? Was that in the middle of a quarter or?
It was the early part of the quarter. It was January of 40. Let's see, January of 43.
Mm-hmm. And before you were overseas, how many different camps were you trained in? Where were you sent?
I was sent first to Fort McPherson.
Mm-hmm.
I believe everybody from this area went through Fort McPherson. Then you were sent from there, depending on what branch you were going to be put in, to various camps around the country. I went to, as I said, to Camp Croft at Spartanburg, and from there, I stayed there on the cadre for until late summer '44, and I was sent to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, to join. I'm not sure of the division. It was an infantry division, and if I were sure, I wouldn't name it because I didn't like the outfit and I asked to be moved out of it. But at any rate, I was in this division, and I didn't think they were ready to go overseas. And the rumor was that we were going directly overseas, and so I asked the company commander if I could be transferred, and he asked why, and I told him, and that insulted him, and he transferred me that afternoon, and that's when I went to Fort Meade, Maryland, and from there on over.
Mm-hmm. How did you cross the Atlantic once more?
On a ship that at that time, prior to the war, was the biggest passenger liner that's under a United States flag. I don't remember the name. I'm sorry. I wish I did, but I believe there were 11,000 of us on it, and it was a fast ship, and they didn't go in a convoy. It was fast enough that they were not worried about subs.
Was it the Queen Mary or Queen Elizabeth?
No, it was not. It was an American ship.
Mm-hmm.
But when I say 11,000, that's crammed in. You know, that's not like I probably carried maybe 2,500 passengers or fewer, but they had a bunch of us on there. And I may be wrong about that. It could have been 9,000, but it was a lot of folks.
How long were you stationed in the United Kingdom?
We
did
just
you see anything of the British?
Not really. We landed at Southampton late in the afternoon, and immediately went on a train and went across England to a little seaport on the Channel side. I don't remember the name of the port. Probably never knew what it was. But at any rate, we boarded some small English ships and went on to Le Havre, France from there. So I just passed through England. And I was just more or less passed through France because we went directly on into Belgium. And from there I joined the 7th Armored Division.
Did you eat pretty well, or was it different in battle? Can you tell me something about the food, the C rations and the K rations versus some other foods you might have had? Can you tell me anything about the food?
The food was good. I couldn't kick about the food. We except for the few times that I was under fire, we had a hot meal at least once a day. Of course, at other times, if there was a lot of fire going around, we ate K rations. I didn't see any C rations for a long time. That, to me, those were a luxury. We didn't. K rations was all I had for a long time.
Can you describe them for me?
They had a little tin of cheese, which is very good cheese, raisin, more or less a raisin bar, and then I believe a chocolate bar, and some crackers. I ate so many of them, I ought to be able to describe it better than that, but that's what I remember. It's been a long time.
Was there anything you were particularly afraid of in that time? Anything that was particularly frightening?
I guess the mortar fire frightened me more than anything else. Because it was pretty devastating, you know. If the ones that I saw hit by it, as I mentioned previously, though, I was lucky. I was not subjected to a lot of it like many of those fellows were. Was it especially cold in those times? Yes, it was. It sure was. It was very cold, and about the hardest thing that we had to do would be in the snow, to dig through the snow and dig a foxhole when the ground was a pretty good crust of frozen ground. With those little picks that we had, it was tough to get a hole in that ground. And sleeping in the snow was not pleasant, but it wasn't as bad as I would have thought it was. I wouldn't want to do it again, but it wasn't as bad as I thought. But in fact, I'm amazingly warm all the time. My hands and feet get very cold, but we had plenty of clothing and blankets. No problem.
Can you describe, can you tell me something of your first impressions of those places? Belgium, was it? Or some of the terrain that...
It was, terrain was beautiful. It was good farmland and well-kept houses, but there was a lot of destruction. There's been some of the small towns. There'd been a lot of bombing, and I guess a lot of it happened late in the war, I would think, right in that particular area. Then later on, we saw some big towns that were almost obliterated. Cologne, I believe, was one of them. I don't remember the names of some of them, but I remember Cologne was. No, let's see. Cologne was, but that's not the town I'm thinking about. My notes and my correspondence to my family from that time, and a lot of photographs and cards that I'd picked up, were lost, I think burned in a cabin that my folks had, and had these among things stored for a period of time, and it burned, and I lost virtually everything I had. So it's difficult to remember names that far back, but we saw lots of destruction in the industrial towns, and in the smaller towns, particularly on up toward the Baltic Sea, no destruction at all, no damage whatever, because there'd been no fighting up there. And by the time we were there, the Germans had, for all practical purposes, the war was over. And they just hadn't announced it yet. But we were, at that time, really collecting prisoners more than anything else, all the way from northern Belgium right on into the Baltic, and then from the Baltic down to the Mulde, I guess you pronounce it, M-U-L-D-E river that joins the Elbe River, about, I'm going to guess, 90 miles east of Berlin. And we were stopped there because I understand the political view was that they should let the Russians get to Berlin first, although the Americans could have been there but way before the Russians if they had not been stopped from doing so. But we sat there, and I suppose we were in that area when the war was over, as I recall. And then later on we moved to southern Germany and were billeted there waiting to see what was going to happen to everybody, whether they were coming home or whether they were going to in or what.
Wow. Can you remember the war's end for me? Did you think you were going to the Pacific Theater from there?
Yes. I didn't like that either, but those of us that didn't have enough points to come home, we'd resign ourselves to it. And I dreaded the voyage. I dreaded getting there almost as bad as going. I mean, because I knew that we would probably go on a Liberty ship, and it'd probably take about 3 months. So I was much relieved when I didn't have to go.
What did a Liberty ship look like?
To me, it looked like a small freighter. Today, you know, we have these tremendous freighters, but this just looked like a small freighter to me. I came home in one, and it took 16 days to get from let's see, I'm trying to remember what port I left from over there. But it took 16 days to get to New York. So I figured that if I'd gone to Pacific, it would have taken maybe 3 months, depending on where I went. The Liberty ships were all right. In fact, it might have been more comfortable than that big liner I went over on, because I don't think they had it quite as crowded on the Liberty ship. I think there was something like less than 2,000 of us Liberty ship coming back.
Do you remember when they dropped the atomic bombs on the Japanese and then the Japanese surrender?
Yes, I sure do.
How did you hear of those events?
I heard those events. Heard of those events when I was at this camp in Antwerp, waiting for orders to, to ship out to Japan. I don't remember how I heard it. I remember I was very happy, but I don't remember how we got word. It would not have been by radio, of course. I suppose that there was an announcement made to the whole camp.
Over a loudspeaker system?
I suppose so.
Can you give me some ideas of the way your career has gone in those 50 years since the World War II era? You mentioned that you came back to the University of Georgia. Can you tell me what field you pursued and what you've been up to?
I came back and went back to school immediately, because I got back at a good time. I got back in early March of '46, and I believe the quarter was starting in late March. And at any rate, I came on back, started the spring quarter, '46, and graduated in December of '47. I went straight through, and I took some extra hours so I could finish. And in the meantime, I got married in '47, in June '47, and I went to work at what was then Athens Manufacturing Company. Then it became Chicopee later, and now the university uses it as a, I suppose, sort of a big storage area. It's over in East Athens. But that time it was a textile plant, and I worked a little while, and then went to work for L.M. Leather's Sons, and worked with them for till about 1950, and then I went into business for myself in the poultry equipment and supply business. The poultry business was growing a lot at that time, and then subsequently I was in that for about 3 years, and then later a couple of local fellows and I started Athens Poultry Company, processing poultry. It's the plant out on Barber Street that is now Seaboard Farms.
Yes, sir.
And we started that little plant in 1953.
What was that land when you began that business there? What did it look like in 1953?
It was, there was just a row of metal warehouses along Oneida Street. Oneida comes into Barber right there at the plant site. Where we built there was just some pine trees and no industry out that way at all at that time. And we built there, and I stayed there. We sold the business to a company called Central Sawyer Company from Fort Wayne, Indiana. Sold it to Central Sawyer in about '62, and I worked for them for 3 years. And then I did some building for a good many years, just small commercial buildings. I'd build them and sell them, or build them and rent them, and then sell them, or build them and rent them and keep them.
We're talking housing?
Commercial. Small commercial. No residential.
I see. Commercial.
Strictly commercial. And did that more or less until about 6 or 8 years ago, and I really don't do much of anything now.
What was the name of your business in commercial real estate and the like?
I just operate as an individual under my own name.
I see. And what neighborhood have you been living at?
I've lived on Fortson Road for about 33 years, just around the corner. And prior to that, we lived on Millage Circle for, I guess, 5 or 6 years, and prior to that on King Avenue.
On King Avenue?
Yeah, lived there when we first married, or soon after we first married.
I used to live there myself.
Is that right?
How did you come to meet your wife in 1947?
I met her first in about 1942. She lived at Cornelia. She was from Cornelia, Georgia, and I met her first. A cousin of mine had a date with her and brought her by the house one Sunday, and I met her. And later dated her some, and then when I got back from overseas, she was here in school then. She's a little bit younger than I am, and we got married not too long after I got back from overseas.
Had you heard anything about her while you were overseas?
I heard from her a little bit. Didn't correspond a great deal, but a little bit.
Did you all have children?
Yes, we have two. We have a son that lives here in Athens, and a daughter that lives in Marietta. The daughter was born in 48, and the son in 51. So they're getting on up a few years on them now.
Let me go back to the World War II era. What did Athens look like in those days? I've heard that the cavalry horse stable was where the Georgia Center was. Were you cavalry at all? Did you?
No,
did you?
strictly infantry.
Infantry.
Uh-huh.
Where would you do those ROTC classes in infantry?
Do you know where, I suppose, is the ROTC building still down by the old theater, the
Fine Arts Theater?
Fine Arts Theater?
Yes, it is, sir.
Okay. Well, it was open down in there. We had drill fields. All did our drill there. The cavalry did their drilling over on Ag Hill.
Mm-hmm.
What was then called Ag Hill is now over there around where the continuing education and the Coliseum is. And Athens was, of course, much smaller. I believe the student enrollment was only about 3,800 at the time. And they had all the freshman rights then that they don't have now. You know, the shirt tail parade where you had to run from downtown to normal town in a shirt and your shorts, not shorts like you wear today, but your undershorts. And if you didn't do it, you had a problem. And my roommate and I failed to do it, and so we had a problem. But you'd get so many licks with a broom, and people say, well, you can't get hit hard with a broom, but you can if the fellow knows how to use it. If he turns it sideways and swings it until just before he hits you and turns it over, it's a pretty potent weapon. But as I say, I believe the school enrollment was about 3,800, and only about 4,500 when I came back and re-entered after I got out of the Army. But it's grown since then.
Well, that was the GI Bill era.
GI Bill, right.
Did you all have any sense of being a couple of years older than you were?
Oh, yeah. Sure did. Sure did. I'll tell you, I really studied. When I got out of the Army, I really studied. And then most of my counterparts did that. In the GI Bill, although it doesn't sound like much now, and I'm sure it costs the government a lot of money, but I believe that married students on the GI Bill got $110 or $120 a month, plus tuition, plus some on books, I believe. And with a little side job, which I had a little side job, you could live pretty well back then. I don't remember what I paid for rent. I had a little apartment out on Millage Avenue, but it wasn't much. Of course, it wasn't much of an apartment either. But we lived all right. We didn't have any money to waste. We lived all right. Go to a movie, I think 25 or 40 cents each, or 30 cents each, or something like that. And you could go to the varsity and get a plain chocolate and 3 hamburgers for $1. So you know, that's pretty inexpensive living.
I'm also interested about details of everyday life, like food. We just talked about the varsity. Were there other foods that you can remember, either from the service or from civilian life, in the way of either restaurants like the varsity or items that were particularly scarce?
Well, during the war, there were gasoline was scarce, of course. Sugar was scarce. All that was rationed. Meat was scarce. It was rationed. Those are the main items. There may have been some staple items rationed too, but I don't think flour and cornmeal were. They may have been. I don't remember. After the war, there were still some shortages that hung on for a while, but meat was scarce for a while and high. At least in those days, we thought it was high. But we had little grocery stores. I remember there was one at Normaltown when we lived on King Avenue, and when we lived in this part of town, there was one out here at the corner of Baxter and Millage, where Universal Insurance building is now, and the Universal, or the Worldwide Travel, right in there. And they delivered groceries. You could call them and you tell them what you wanted, and they would deliver groceries right to your house. You didn't have to worry about transportation. Of course, there was no bus system. There was not a bus system at all. I mean, in-town bus system. There was a Greyhound bus, of course. And the campus on Ag Hill, it was bare then compared to what it is now. The stadium held about half what it holds now. Football stadium.
Mm-hmm. If I mentioned the names of some leaders, could you tell me what you thought at the time of, say, FDR, Roosevelt?
I thought that I thought he was very effective as a president. Thinking back, I realized that even then he was a little bit liberal for me. He was, I thought, too easy on the unions at the time. I remember sitting in a foxhole in Belgium when the coal miners went out on strike. Mm-hmm. And of course, that irritated me no end, and irritated everybody else that was over there, except unless it was a coal miner sitting over in a foxhole. He might have had sympathy for him, but I thought Roosevelt was very effective as a leader in wartime. But other than that, I didn't admire him a great deal.
And say General Patton, how'd you feel about that?
Well, I don't. You know as much about Patton as I do. I don't. You know, the only thing I know is what I read. And that, of course, that's all I knew about Roosevelt too. But Patton was pretty loud, I thought. Pretty much of a braggart, I thought.
Mm-hmm. How about some others?
Well, Eisenhower, I thought did a pretty good job. Mm-hmm. And I say pretty good job. He won the war, but of course, you got to put everything in perspective. He had untold millions of men, untold billions of dollars at his beck and call, and of course, you know, that helps to do something. But there may have been a lot better generals, is what I'm saying. I don't mean to be, I don't mean to say that I didn't think Eisenhower, he did a great job. But there may have been some other generals that could have done as well or better. I don't know. I thought Bradley, from what I've read since, maybe one of the best, and of course Marshall must have been one of the greatest of all. Let's see, that's about the only ones I can think of. But I don't have any complaints about any of them. But if you ask me, you know, I'll tell you.
I'm asking. And Harry Truman, did you know who he was when he came to be president upon Roosevelt's death?
No. No, I sure didn't. I'd heard of him, but that's about all. I've read a lot about him since then, and I think he did a pretty good job. Pretty good job. And of course, I was glad he got that war over. Mm-hmm. I'm sure it was a tough decision for him, and probably always will be a lot of people who will condemn him for it, but he took a lot of lives, but he saved a lot too. He saved a lot for the Japanese as well as the Allies. If it had gone on, it would have been just a bloodletting for everybody.
boy, I'm reaching. When you came home to Athens, what's the first thing you wanted to do?
I don't remember in any one particular thing. I was just glad to get home. I was glad to get back to school and want to get it over with. And I was just, and it was nice to be able to get certain things, you know, to get a glass of milk or some peanuts whenever you wanted them, and just little things. No more K rations. And I wasn't over there nearly as long as some of those guys. I mean, some of them over there, as you know, 3.5 years, and see, I was about 1.5 years I was gone. So they must really have been hungry for something at home, home cooking, getting back to school or whatever they were going to do.
Were your letters censored during those years?
Yes, they were until the war was over.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they were after that.
No.
But they were, and you know, understandably so, during wartime. I don't know how much censoring they did, but and I suppose most folks did like I did. They tried not to write anything that would need censoring. In fact, I didn't even know where I was most of the time.
Mm-hmm. That era of Belgium and then the Battle of the Bulge, about to come up on a 50th anniversary of that there. Was that pretty fierce?
Yeah, I understand it was. It was, and it must have been from because when I joined the 7th Armored Division, I went into the 38th Armored Infantry Battalion, which is part of the 7th Armored, and virtually everybody was new. I mean, they had been pretty well wiped out, and I don't think they were hit much harder than a lot of the other units. They were really hit hard though, and of course after I joined, it was mainly a mopping up operation then. We had to dig in, and you had to go slowly, and you couldn't just run through those. We were in lots of forests at that time, and a little bit hilly, and lots of snow, and you had to. We didn't make a lot of progress there for you know several. I lose track of time, but for 3 or 4 weeks, I would say. And then all at once, we were just barreling along the roads, you know, and prisoners were streaming back, going back behind us, and we moved right on up to the Baltic Sea pretty soon. Well, we got to the Baltic in early spring, so I was joined them in December, so we were not. I don't think we ran into any opposition anywhere except one spot after we got through those pockets in there around where the bulge was, and we ran into some opposition near an old, I suppose it was an old World War, it was built after World War II. It was something like a Maginot Line when France built that, you know, after the war. Of course, the Germans they burst right through that thing when they attacked, but I remember there were a lot of pillboxes, and I spent about 3 nights in one of those pillboxes, and it was a big concrete construction, of course, and it's hard to say how big it was. It looked pretty big, though, to me at that time. We had to get into it, you could crouch real low and crawl through sort of a tunnel. Then you get inside, and they had openings, gun openings, and you were protected from the weather inside. It wasn't warm, but we had some opposition right in that area there, and I really don't remember the names of the towns or that much about it. And then we had a lot of fire and lots of mortar thrown at us right near the Rhine River, and we held up. Our unit, 7th, I guess all of the 7th, held up right on the eastern bank of the Rhine, while probably Patton and some others were crossing the point. Some of the English north of us, and Patton, I think, south of us, and we sat there for, I believe, something like maybe 10 days, and we were billeted in nice buildings. The people had abandoned these houses along the Rhine there and gone somewhere else. All the houses were vacant. Nice homes, nice little hotels. I was in a hotel with about 12 other guys. We had the whole hotel, and we had guns set up outside the hotel, right on the banks of the Rhine. And although, to my knowledge, our group never used those guns. We didn't see anybody. But they were there, and our troops couldn't cross right at that time until they were encircled from the north and south, and then our group went on across, went over on pontoon bridges.
Were there characters in the companies of men you saw? Was there anybody who stands out in your memory?
Yes, there were some. We had a very outstanding, I thought, a very outstanding. We called him tech sergeant back then. Some folks, he filled the role of a master sergeant, I guess, but he was really a tech sergeant. And I had a squad of heavy machine gunners, and this fellow was he was a good soldier, and he kept everybody moving, and he didn't put up with any horseplay at all, and if you didn't want to do your share, you were in trouble with him. But there were lots of real nice folks. Unfortunately, I lost my records, and I don't have any addresses. A few I have kept in touch with. I saw one about last year about this time in Maine, and that I had not seen since then. I had talked with him some, had some correspondence with him, and but I have not had the opportunity to have reunions because I was a replacement. Mm-hmm. So I was never really a part of the 7th Armored. I mean, even though I joined it, and I was there for a very brief period, and then the war was over, and then I was assigned to an engineering company to stay out my stay over there. So after I lost my records of these fellows and their addresses, I suppose some of them would be available, but unfortunately a lot of them are dead. And some that I know are dead, some that I kept in touch with.
About the handful of folks he has kept in touch with, though his records have burned, and the fact that he bumped into one in Maine, and there was a thought. I just interrupted, sir.
I don't remember what it was, Brent.
Let me ask you if you've been able to travel in your retirement, and if you've been able to see any of the country that you couldn't see while you were working. I know that you probably traveled quite a bit as a serviceman. You just mentioned you were in Maine.
Right. We've been to Maine probably about 3 times, and I had tried on one other occasion to reach him, and then the other time we were not close to his home, and I didn't. But this time we called ahead of time and made a point to go through his home, and we've traveled elsewhere a good bit. We've been in most of the states and spent a good bit of time out in the Northwest.
The Northwest? You're talking about Oregon and Washington State?
Right. Oregon and Washington we've spent a good bit of time in, and British Columbia and most of the Canadian provinces.
Have you been able to go back to Europe?
I haven't wanted to. Went one time and went to Germany, went to southern Germany, and in some of the places that I was in after the war was over, and in one town where I stayed about 10 days in this hotel on the Rhine, but I couldn't recognize anything. Like here, it changed so much I couldn't pick out any landmarks. I enjoyed the trip, but I really couldn't tie it to my tenure over there. But we've enjoyed traveling here, and we've tried to see most of the country. And what we do is we usually fly to a point and get a car and make a big circle, and then fly back, because I don't. It's a time-consuming thing to drive that far and see what you want to see and then drive back. And I don't think when you consider the fact that you can get these economy rates at times on the airlines, and the really quite cheap to rent cars, particularly on an unlimited mileage basis. It's amazing how little per mile it costs you when you figure the rental rate and the gasoline that you put in it, compared to getting in your car and driving all the way out there and back and having those hotels to pay for on the way. So we've accomplished it by, as I say, we fly to Phoenix, get a car, and we've flown to Albuquerque, get a car, and we've been in California 3 different times to cover that state. Is so big, and Denver, and there's been a hub for us on 3 different trips, and Missoula, Montana on one, and so we've seen it that way, and it's the easy way, and I think a fairly economical way to do it too.
Can I ask you about some of the commercial properties you developed? Would I know some of those locations?
You wouldn't. They're all small and aimed at a fairly small company that needs some warehouse area with shipping dock capability and a small office, and that's what I've developed. And as I say, I've sold most of them. Still have about 4 of them, and I've developed nothing big. I mean, like a shopping center, that sort of thing. That was beyond my scope and capabilities. But Athens has been a good place to live, and we've enjoyed it. And I want to say about the Army that I certainly wouldn't want to do it again, but it was good for me, and it was good for most of the people that I know. It taught us all some discipline and maybe appreciation for a lot of things that we didn't appreciate before. And I know that this is not a popular belief, but I believe that if there were mandatory service for everybody today of not a long period of time, but some period of time to really teach them discipline and really teach them how to appreciate some of the things they didn't appreciate prior to that service, that it might be a good thing for this country. Let's say that's an opinion that's not shared by a lot of people.
Well, let me ask you another opinion question that I usually wind up these interviews with. If you were talking to younger people who might only know of World War II as history through books or even videotapes like this one, is there something that you would emphasize from the experiences we've talked about as being most important? What do you think is most valuable or important of the experiences we've talked about?
Of the experiences I had, or of the war itself?
Any of it. I mean, I'm just asking you,
well,
what would you emphasize?
Gee, Brent, I don't know.
That's okay.
It bothers me today that a lot of people don't have any compulsion at all to do something for the government. And of course it's getting more and more that way, and if I live under this type of government much longer, I might be the same way. But I know I didn't want to go in the Army when I went in. I would a lot rather have not gone in, but all my friends were going in, and my acquaintances, and my brother was in the Army, my dad had been in World War I. I would have felt more uncomfortable not going than I did going, and I was very uncomfortable going. I guarantee you, I was homesick the first minute I was there. And today, I believe folks will take a jail term before they do that, and that bothers me. But I don't know what I would relay to someone else about what I learned from it.
I believe you already have. I believe you have. How long did your father live? You mentioned he had tuberculosis and TB in World War I.
Uh-huh.
And was probably still alive during World War II?
He was. Uh-huh. It's amazing. He had emphysema very bad, beginning, I suppose, about 1975. No, it was before that, 1965. But he lived to be 78 in spite of all his infirmities and having had tuberculosis for a long period of time when he was younger, and that's amazing.
Did he stay in Alto?
Uh-huh. He stayed there until it was moved to Rome, Georgia, to become Batty State Hospital, and he stayed there until he retired at age 70 and moved to a little place on Lake Lanier and lived there for a while, and then came down here and lived here in Athens till he died. Mm-hmm.
And your brother, what became of him?
He's in Jacksonville. He worked for Southern Bell. Well, went to work for AT&T in Cincinnati, and went from there to Philadelphia, and ended up in Miami with Southern Bell, and then in Jacksonville. And I guess he was in Jacksonville for 15, 20 years before he retired. He's older than I am. I'm 71. He's 76. And he's been retired about 11 years from Southern Bell, or a little longer than that. He still lives in Jacksonville in reasonably good health.
Anything you care to add about the World War II era or the rest of your career?
I can't think of anything. I had mixed emotions about coming here for the interview because, you know, what I did was so insignificant compared to so many of them. That bothered me because I said, gee, I know lots of folks he might want to talk to prior to me, but good Lord, Irwin had asked me to come, and I said, good Lord, I'll do it, but I said, I want to say that there are just so many folks he ought to get before me, because I just had such a small role in it. And he said, well, I'd like for you to come. I told him I wouldn't, so that's the reason I came. And after I talked to you, I told you I'd be here, so I came. But I came against my best judgment, really.
Well, I'm glad you did, and I appreciate Dr. Irwin's arm twisting because, again, that's another valuable point of view. And I tell you, it must have taken a lot of guys like yourself, and I'm very grateful for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Brent.
Let me unclip you, sir.
All right, sir.